Now, it is the holiday season, and I have to confess, one of my favorite things is A Christmas Carol, the tale of Scrooge's redemption through the visitation of three spirits, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. I will watch all of the different versions until my husband is completely distracted on a 24-hour repeating loop. So, my selection for today comes from A Christmas Carol. Perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk. For there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet there was the ghost of Christmas present blessing his house. Looking to the interior, up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes and, getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired and yearned to show his fancy linen to the fashionable parks. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt their goose and known it was their own because it was basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onions. The young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and eaten. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha warn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha," cried the two young Cratchits, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal, as the others chimed in, "There is such a goose, Martha." Martha replied, "We had a deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless you." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his little limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way home from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day." Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came and prematurely leapt from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" cried Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful by himself, sitting so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home he hoped people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame bakers walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing very strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough? Suppose it should break in turning out? Somebody could have gotten over the wall in the backyard and stolen it. While they were merry with goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid, all sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck in the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he was regarded it as the greatest success achieved in their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she could confess that she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to have thought such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put down upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch, without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unchanged by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Please say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear the wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven You are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among the hungry brothers in the dust. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. Mr. Dexter.
How fitting. This weekend I'm actually going to a play for the Christmas Carol. It's gonna be so. What a great introduction for me this weekend. Christmas Carol is definitely one of my favorite plays, and I thought you did a great job reading your brief paragraph. The play obviously is about the present, the past, and the future of Christmas. I love some of your emphasis on sprinkling of touch, cheap with 6 pence, threadbare clothing. The emphasis that you placed on that, vocal variety, was very, very good. You had a pause. You were going from, a scene where he's talking about, what is exactly, let's say, where he says, God bless and Merry Christmas to all, and then the next thing you're on to be more somber about where he was talking about the fate. It was Timmy, I believe was his name. It's been a while since I've read the Christmas story. But there was a great pause and a great transition right in there that took place. The one thing that I think you could improve on a little bit in your speech is the use of arm movement. You had a great one where you had your hands up over your head, where you said hello and your hands were up over your head. But then there was one where I thought you could have injected in here where you were talking about hugged his daughter. He was talking about hugging his daughter really well, and I thought you could just sort of maybe hug yourself. But of course that's me, and that's something I probably would have done. Other than that, I think you did a very great job. Just use a little more hand movement just to make your speech a little more enticing. Mr. Evaluator.